Thank you so much for that introduction, high expectations to live up to. And what I'm going to talk about today is what does it take to be great? So that means, what does it take to be a successful student, a teacher, a parent? Scientists know very little about motivation, and they are using research now to answer that question. But if you have any connection or affiliation with UMBC, you already know what part of the answer is. It is grit. And so what is grit? Angela Duckworth, the New York Times winning author, defines grit as determination through adversity. There's another psychologist, who is Andrea Hawkins Lewis. And she's actually articulates grit in a very dimensional way. She talks about the 4 dimensions of grit. So number 1 is growth, having a new and fresh idea that really motivates you to the next step. Resilience, which we often hear about, again, moving through despite adversity. And instinct, or what I call intuition, listening to your gut and just kind of doing what feels right. And finally, tenacity. So that is that do or die attitude, pushing through to the next step. So what I'm going to talk about today are 2 things. Number 1, how grit and my foundations at UMBC have helped to prepare me forward to be a successful physician scientist, to try to help to solve some of these problems, particularly in Alzheimer's disease, and how I'm using the concept of grit and studying grit in patients with memory loss so that we can actually find new cures and treatments. So first I'm going to talk about growth. So growth is something that really propels us forward. And so for me, it starts with planting a seed. And in my case, the seed was planted when I was 9 years old. And it happened from my grandmother suffering from diabetes. So her delicious cooking would fill the hills of Alabama, greeting us every summer after a long drive from Baltimore. But the summer when I was 9 years old was very different. My grandfather died. My grandmother moved to the city so that my aunt could administer her insulin shots. But being the proud woman that she was, she stubbed her toe. But she didn't want to go to the doctor for such a minor thing. So first, her right toe became ulcerated, and then her foot, and eventually her entire leg. The surgeons, as you can imagine, ultimately had to intervene, eventually amputating both of her legs. That was the only treatment that the physicians had at that time for her diabetic neuropathy. But that was just unacceptable to me. So I made the decision at 9 years old that I was going to be a doctor, and I was going to find a cure for diabetes to help patients like my grandmother. Now looking back, that sounds like a very naive idea in the eyes of an overambitious child. But it really has been that seed that has propelled me forward to graduate from UMBC, to pursue medical school, to get a PhD in neuroscience and become a faculty member. And so this is where the foundation really comes to be able to have that idea and to grow. And so the other thing is that really resilience and persistence and growth comes from family. So I had my nuclear parents, my mom and dad, John and Eddie Watkins, who were both educators, and my older sister, Stephanie, who had skipped 2 grades and graduated high school at 15. So the bar was set very high before I came to UMBC. But it's interesting, so that when I came to UMBC, developed surrogate parents, Dr. Freeman Rabowski and Ernestine Baker, who really helped to cement and plant that new idea that I could actually be whatever I wanted to be. So Jonas Salk, the inventor of the polio vaccine, says that parents give 2 things to children: roots, so that they have a foundation, and then wings, so they can impart that knowledge that you've taught to them and then go off and share that with other people. And so it's really my roots at UMBC, the roots that I got in math and science, and then also that work ethic that I learned, that I was able to now come back and mentor other students here and be able to help to teach the next generation. So that brings me to another interesting thing that I think was wonderful, is that when I was 17, I came to UMBC as part of the M3 Meyerhoff class. I had graduated from Delaney High School, the first African-American class president. I'd never missed a day of school from kindergarten to 12th grade, and I'd gotten accepted to every school I applied to, including Yale and the University of Pennsylvania, and even gotten scholarships to UVA. And so I'd always felt like I was different. But when I came to UMBC for the Meyerhoff Scholarship Weekend, everyone else around me had accomplished just as much, if not even more. And it really inspired me to know that I was going to have an environment where I would be able to grow, think about new ideas, and propel to the next step. And so that work ethic, high expectations, not just getting your A, but helping other people to get an A. That was really foundation and a new idea and a new concept for the Meyerhoff program and Dr. Hrabowski. And so then that brings us to resilience. So resilience really is what Dr. Hrabowski says. Being smart means that you're ready to learn. Resilience means that you actually are then taking those steps and that ability to go to the next level. And so it's interesting that when I was here at UMBC, the main thing that I remember is being offered lots of opportunities. So I was able to believe in my passion and knowledge and be able to have wonderful experiences as a freshman, first working at Johns Hopkins when my first job before that had been at Burger King, and then spent a summer at Harvard working with Dr. Frances Jensen, who's now the chair of the neurology department at University of Pennsylvania. And the interesting thing about Dr. Jensen is that at the time she was a professor, one of the youngest professors, and also had twins. So she taught me that you could actually be a mother and a scientist. And then finally, I spent my senior year here at UMBC's campus with Dr. Patricia McGraw, studying yeast genetics. And then all of those exciting experiences really helped me to develop the pride, passion, and belief in science and wanting to determine what I wanted to do. So then the thing about those experiences are that in hindsight, they were really hard work. The organic chemistry class really kicked my butt. And a lot of the times I felt that I couldn't go on. But it was that community, the UMBC community, that told me and that believed in me that I could go to the next step. And what I learned is that resilience really has to do with several factors. Number one, a winning self-attitude. It's not just about your ability, but your attitude and the way that you approach things. Knowing that when one door closes, another one is open to you. And that also gets back to what I feel is in my gut. So what I think about intuition. So intuition is working smarter but not harder, but really and truly, I had the opportunity after those experiences as an undergrad to then work with Dr. Solomon Snyder, the chair and founder of the neuroscience department at Johns Hopkins, and someone who I think is almost as smart as Einstein. He's won everything except maybe the Nobel Prize. And so what Saul said is that intuition is following your curiosity and then using your creativity to solve problems. And it's interesting, so when we think about medicine and pre-med, we think of like a cutthroat environment. But what Saul's lab fostered was more so collaboration, working together, and curiosity. So it was just a wonderful environment to learn. And when we encounter things where an experiment wouldn't work, I could go across the hall or down the street, or across the bench, actually, to a partner and say, well, how would you look at this? And that's why I became very successful, and Saul's lab actually continues to be very successful. And it was really working together. So often, as an African-American female, I was the only one. The only female, the only woman, the only one from Baltimore, born and raised. You get the message. But I was able to connect with people on a very common level. We had a love for science. We wanted to solve problems. We wanted to do things differently. And so that collaboration, that intuition, and the intellect really is what helped to propel me forward. And so being in Saul's lab, I was able to make great discoveries as a emerging scientist. So I have a lot of brilliant people around me. So my research studied the nitric oxide and carbon monoxide as co-neurotransmitters in the enteric and central nervous system. Translated, that means I studied gases and how they work on nerves. And it was very exciting because, again, going back to intuition, it took me back to my roots thinking about my grandmother and I actually studied diabetes or diabetic gastroparesis and found a way to treat people that have diabetic nerve disorders, which was really, really wonderful and exciting, to the point where we were able to have a patent, a discovery, a Viagra for the use of nerve disorders, a clinical trial, and as we heard in the introduction, my work was featured on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And so that sounds very wonderful, but I didn't tell you the rest of the story, which is often sometimes the experiments would fail. We would submit a paper, it would be rejected, we've applied for grants, and we didn't get them. But one thing that Saul always told me, the difference between a good scientist and a great scientist is being able to resubmit that paper, redo that experiment, do things differently, and keep pressing on. And that really is what we talked about, tenacity. So tenacity is persistence, but then what you're also doing, you look at what you're doing, you implement it, you manage and adjust. And it was really that tenacity that propelled me forward to also join the faculty at Johns Hopkins. I was able to combine my PhD in neuroscience and my love for nerves with my interest in psychiatry, because I thought that that was a new frontier. There are very few treatments that we know about. What do we know about schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and depression? So I saw this as a new frontier, and I always love a challenge. And then in addition to that, I was able to then combine those interests, the clinical interest as well as my scientific interest, to be able to teach other students, so my 3 passions. And bringing all that together really has brought me to this point where I'm able to help other people look at the memory loss and being able to persevere through memory loss. So I'm currently the director of the Memory Clinic, and I love getting up every day because it's Sunday night and I say, what problem can I solve tomorrow? What family can I help? And what new discovery or treatment can we work on for other people? So what I do on a daily basis is I diagnose and treat all types of memory disorders, and then I also provide research and education for the next generation of psychiatrists and neuroscientists that are coming up. But the thing that I often love is that I'm able to work with families, loved ones, daughters, spouses, to be able to find resources for their parents when the traditional treatments, like the ones for my grandmother, have failed them. And so one of the most common questions I get asked is, what is dementia? So dementia is a syndrome. It's an umbrella term for all the different types of memory loss that we may have. So Alzheimer's disease happens to be the most common. And we've known about Alzheimer's disease since 1906, when Dr. Alzheimer actually did an autopsy on the brain of a person who developed memory loss at an early age and found changes, some plaques and tangles and differences in the brain. And so what I like to do with the modern day research of Alzheimer's is actually look at patients, living patients, so we don't have to do autopsies, and be able to use brain imaging to look at those plaques and tangles in the brain, and then also do prevention, because we know ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And Alzheimer's really is something that we talk about nowadays, but it will probably affect everyone in this room. How many people know someone who has memory loss, who has suffered from memory loss? So the estimates are that there are about 5.7 million people today that suffer from dementia. And as the population ages, we expect that those numbers will accelerate up until about 14 million. So basically, in translating that, that means that about every 65 seconds, someone will be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. So why is this important? Because we've been talking about grit. So growth, resilience, intuition, and tenacity. And what we are finding nowadays, in addition to the different treatments to help to alter those plaques and tangles, we're actually able to capture the essence of perseverance in these patients and be able to determine why and how some people are diagnosed with Alzheimer's and develop it within 2 years, whereas others, it's progressed and there's a delay of about 20 years. And so when we think about perseverance, we think about success despite adversity. When we think about perseverance and resilience and memory loss, what it actually means, if you look at the slide, is that we have these predetermined things. We have our genetic makeup, our environment, education, lifestyle, and development that kind of predispose us to whether we get any type of illness. But when we're looking at resilience and memory loss, what we find is that there are some people despite all of these things, despite having the gene that says you're going to get Alzheimer's disease, despite having a parent or a sister that has Alzheimer's disease, don't develop the illness. And so when we look further, what we find is that there are key characteristics that prevent, despite looking at that pathology or those plaques and tangles, that prevent people from actually having the symptoms. And so I thought that that was very interesting, and I wanted to study that a little bit better. So what we call it's called cognitive reserve. And so what I've been looking at, as well as several groups across the nation, are what are the components of cognitive reserve, and how can we, number one, prevent the development of Alzheimer's disease, and number two, once you have it, how can we delay the progression? And so there are really 4 things that researchers have found that have been very instrumental in managing dementia, even more so than some of the more common drugs. So number one, everyone's here in this campus and this beautiful new building. Number one, championing education. Education has a protective way of helping you to manage and prevent memory loss. So so we now have a way to look at brains. It's called positive emission tomography, or PET. And so what the PET imaging does, it allows us to not just look at structure, but also function, how the brain is working and what part of the brain is working. And that's my daughter speaking over there, so she's trying to interrupt me just like at home, but she's listening too, I know. And so what happens is, if you look at the image, when we're looking at a PET scan, I'm going to turn everyone into a radiologist. When the lights are on, that means someone is home. So anything that's bright red means that part of the brain is working, and it's working at its maximum capacity. And when it's dark, when the lights are off, that means no one's home or it's not working. So as you can see this image, Dr. Thomas Grabowski, who's at West Virginia University, was one of the pioneers for using PET scans to study perseverance and grit in patients with dementia. And as you can see, it turns out that people that have above a high school education, in and of itself, that front part of the brain and the side part of the brain, which help us with memory and learning, are both very vibrant. And so if you have a high school education, then that front part of the brain isn't as resilient. And then if you have below a high school education, then that actually changes things. So it's not just how far you've gotten in school, but it's also the different types of stimulus. So even if you have a high school education, but if you're reading, if you're still trying to learn, if you're taking other classes, that is really protective. The second thing is, once you're midlife, whatever you're doing now, if you stop and take a snapshot, whatever you're doing now in your life, that's how when you fast forward 40 years from now, that's what you're going to be doing. So my oldest patient is 102. She was driving until she was 93, and she lived by herself until she was 95, and she was a former teacher. And one of the things that she started to do, she had a heart attack when she was in her 40s, and then she started to change her lifestyle. She changed her diet and her exercise pattern. And ever since then, she's actually been very well. So that's the other thing. So researchers have shown that early interventions, exercise and diet, are also, so some of the things that we do from a social perspective are very important in preserving memory. The fourth thing is really how we manage with stress, how we manage stress. So being a undergrad major, being a mother of 4 children, all of these things, stress is a daily part of my life. So what we've been doing in our lab is actually using PET imaging to look at resilience and coping. So there are certain questions and ways that people deal with everyday life and challenges. And what we're able to do is look at those questionnaires and what we call coping capacity or coping skills, and then do that same type of brain imaging. And we find that people who have developed a certain type of resilience with coping actually do really well, and they actually do better on their memory tests than patients that don't have that tool. So those of you who haven't learned how to deal with stress, the positive thing is that there are ways that we can actually teach and retrain the brain to be able to cope with stress better. And so the fourth thing is actually empowering people with memory loss to stay connected with the community. So again, building up that front part of the brain and the side part of the brain with connections. So just because you have a diagnosis doesn't mean that that's the end of things. So patients as well as their family members need to have a connection. So one of the other things is going to social programs, eating together programs, exercising together, having family members visit, whether it's coming over and having a general conversation or getting together for those Sunday dinners. What we're now able to do with these PET images is we're able to actually look and see how those simple social things actually can help with memory loss. So we've talked about grit, growth, resilience, intuition, and tenacity. We talk about resilience, and that's a beautiful word. When we think about resilience, we think about after a fire, the new trees and shrubs that emerge, or after a flood, a community rebuilding. And when we think of grit, we think of some things like a little bit dirty, a little bit grimier. But I think that's the legacy of UMBC. Grit implies hard work and determination, along with resilience. And so that has been the UMBC legacy. So the foundation that I've had here with UMBC and learning those principles and concepts of that philosophy of working harder now and building upon that for the future is really important, to the point where I'm just so happy to be able to share some of these concepts with my niece Lauren, who is now here at UMBC trying to actually further work in Alzheimer's disease, other UMBC alums, and then also my family, who I believe hopefully will be future Meyerhoff students. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And remember to foster those principles, not just for your daily life, but also for your long-term health. Thank you.